Welcome to Rediscovering Wisdom podcast, where we talk about human nature, happiness, and the hidden costs of civilization. Sharing bold insights with author Chet Shupe on why true contentment begins when we listen to our instincts.
My name is Chet Shupe, and I've written a book, Rediscovering the Wisdom of Human Nature, How Civilization Destroyed Happiness. And I'm about to publish a short book of 4 essays that's entitled How the Rational Mind Repressed the Emotional Mind into Submission once human got the spoken word. My background is in electronics engineering. And so I'm looking at human behavior from a, as far as I know, unique perspective. And that is system control theory. I see the species as a real organism, not the individual. And so I see the brain as a controller of the species, not of the individual. Now, the brain, of course, has to control the individual. But since the species is a real organism, the individual is controlled on behalf of serving the species. I mean, a real straightforward example of that is sex. If the members of a species if the species could not control the members sufficiently to get them to copulate, then the species wouldn't exist very long. But, well, that's pretty obvious. But it's also obvious once you think about it, that if the species couldn't get its members to eat or to drink water, then the species wouldn't last very long either. So even when the individual is serving self, that in the long run is serving the species. So when we look at the species from this perspective that it has to control its members for the species to be a self-sustaining process, and incidentally, it does have to be a self-sustaining process, or life would not exist. So when I look at the life of a species from the species perspective, it becomes pretty obvious that unless the species could control the behavior of its members, life would not be a self-sustaining process, in which case life would not exist. But in a civilized world, we, all of our laws, all of our systems of accountability, look at it as if the individual is the ultimate expression of life. It sort of puts us in a situation where if we can't make it on our own, then we're not good enough. It makes no connection between us, our well-being, and the well-being of the species. Now, how did this come about? Well, I was watching a podcast, Dr. Neil Tyson's Star Talk, And he had on as a guest Dr. Robert Sapolsky of Stanford University, who is well known for a neurologist who is well known for his studies of human behavior. And the issue of the podcast was free will. Do people have free will or not? Well, I'm not going to try to prove that here one way or another. I happen to believe from my studies that we don't have free will either. Because if we did have free will, there is no way that the species could control its members. And therefore, realize the species objective, which is to be self-sustaining. So, and an interesting point comes up, which civilization, the whole concept, or people who believe in the concept, has never had to deal with before. And that is if we are not free will. Then it makes no sense to be judging us as good or evil on the basis of the decisions we make. If those decisions are conditioned by evolution, by inborn wisdom, by indoctrination, by personal experience, then goodness knows what decisions a person might make. And that is how the civilization has justified itself. But basically, the foundation on which civilization is based is social contracting. In other words, the object of civilized life is to maintain order. And so, and that's got to be the foundational principle. In other words, we have to pass judgment. In other words, the social contracts essentially say what we have to do and what we don't have to do if there's going to be order in this culture. And so then it becomes a very natural thing to say, if someone doesn't comply with that order, they will have to be punished. Otherwise, there is no reference for order. In other words, civil order is based on the notion that humans are inherently disorderly. We are inherently would do, if there wasn't moral laws, it would be like we had no reference for order whatsoever. And because we believe that, we have justified proclaiming people as good or evil based on whether they comply with prescribed laws or not. Just on the basis that humans couldn't exist without that. So civilizations failed cycle after cycle. Part of their failure is habitat destruction. The habitat destruction that is becoming worldwide at this point. And we create these justice systems in the name of justice, despite the fact that virtually all of them result in a few people owning all the wealth. But we accept that. That's kind of crazy in a way, mindless. Here you've created a justice system that enables a few people to own all the world's wealth, which they couldn't do without the justice system. But we accept that. We think that's rational because we are more concerned about life becoming chaotic without the social contract, without the right to judge people, then we're concerned about the injustices that result. And so it's rational. Well, but it's rational only because we think without justice systems, life would be chaotic. And I am questioning that. And I think if more and more people come to recognize that we in fact do not have free will, well, then there might come a time when a major portion of civilized people have to question that. And I think what the question is there a reference for social order or a reference for life-sustaining order? Because that's what's important. If the order we comply with cannot result in a self-sustaining existence, then life is not going to be here much longer. And so the issue is, right now, we think that social contracting is necessary for there to be sustainable human life on this planet. But hopefully there will come a time when we recognize that though it seems that way today, and it has seemed that way since we started social contracting around 5,000 years ago, that life has been going on this planet now for millions of years. And throughout those millions of years, social contracting did not exist. There were no prescribed laws. And so the question becomes, where did the order come from that sustained that life? And human life's included amongst that. We've been on this, Homo sapiens have been here for some 200,000 or 300,000 years. And through most of that time, there was no good or evil. There was no social contracting. There were no prescribed laws. Well, I propose that that order comes from within us. The order required to sustain life comes from within us. And it's based on instinct, which has genetically accumulated. Instincts is basically innate wisdom that has been genetically accumulated through the process of trial and error since the first surge of life on Earth. In other words, just like the length of our arms and legs, that's genetically accumulated wisdom. Also, the times when we, our behavior, like when we eat, when we stop eating, when we have sex, when we don't have sex, when we take care of someone, when we reject someone, when we sacrifice, or when we kill. That is all based on genetic wisdom also. And the wisdom that worked out on behalf of the species, sometimes it results in self-sacrifice. Sometimes it results in killing. Those are the extremes, but it results in all the behavior in between. It turns out that the probabilities are that when people do those, then it does serve the species. There's no proof. But if we're going to be true to ourselves, and how do we serve the species? What it means is we be true to ourselves. There doesn't have to be a Bible. The elephants don't have a good book to go look at to see what they should do. They do what feels right, and they feel happy, they feel contented. If they were to do what feels wrong, then they would suffer from guilt, just like we would. You know, the hero, when the newsman asks the hero, why did you do that? He sort of gives you the whole story right there. He says, because I knew I could never live with myself if I didn't. In other words, his inner wisdom, his wisdom that maintains order, life-sustaining order, would have punished him with guilt. See, in the real world, in the spiritually free culture where animate beings are free to be true to who they are, you don't have to have a prison to punish people. You get it from inside with guilt. Why would anyone do anything that would burden their life with guilt? On the other side of the coin, you don't have to give trophies or money or things like that for rewards, because the reward for doing what feels right is contentment. And there is no higher reward than that. Because when you feel contented, you can really rest. You see, we live in a world in which our rewards are realizing personal ambitions. We can't feel contented because we have to obey prescribed laws. You can't serve life and obey prescribed laws. Most of the times you'd have to do just the opposite. So, and the hero gives that side of it too. He says, I was just doing what anyone else would have done if they'd have been in my situation. In other words, he was in a situation that called him to be true to his spirit. And that is why I think life works without having to socially contract in order so everyone's behavior would be predictable. I mean, from a rational point of view, it sounds perfect. But what the intellectual mind doesn't realize is that there is an emotional intelligence there also. And that emotional intelligence is what governs the life of a species in such a way that it is self-sustaining. And I don't know, I am presuming that the object of life is to sustain itself. Now, in one sense, we who think the object has to be going to the moon or something might see that as a little weak objective. But if that wasn't the objective of life for millions of years, self-sustainable, you and I wouldn't exist. So we need to ask ourselves, is self-sustainability a reasonable objective? Well, given that it's responsible for my existence, I vote, yeah, I think that's good. And so what we've got to answer is, when we make human life predictable according to prescribed law, by threatening to deny people their civil rights if they don't obey that law, then does that result in a sustainable way of life? That's the question. And that's a question that it seems to me that civilized people have never addressed. And so when I see issues like arguments that say, hey, the decisions we make are due to preconditioning, then that brings up the possibility that at a very fundamental level, civil law is senseless. Because if our decisions are based on preconditioning, then it makes no sense to be judging us as good or evil based on the things we do. There's got to be another way for life to be sustainable. And I think there's a lot of people, given the world situation, that are looking pretty hard first to understand how this could have happened, but looking hard for another way. Well, just realizing that being true to ourselves is the only way life has ever been self-sustainable. Of course, you're not being true to, the evolution, the species created you. That's who you are. You didn't create yourself. So when we're being true to ourselves, we're being true to the species. And not only that, we get rewarded with contentment for being true to the species. We can be true to the law, and the greatest reward we're ever going to get will be for realizing personal ambitions. But those rewards, that isn't contentment. That's just excitement. I've done something that's big. But 3 or 4 days after we've had the mountaintop experience, after 30 years at realizing this ambition, then we'll find out we got to set another goal to have a reason to keep going. Well, do we want to live this way, or do we want to take care of life in a relationship to the people around us and be rewarded with intimacy, contentment, loving and being loved? All of those which having to comply with social contracts wipe out. Because when you're complying with social contract, you are being controlled with good intentions. There's no bad intentions here, but you're being controlled by systems of authority that don't even recognize that we must serve the species if life is going on. Well, I'll leave it at that for now. My website is Spiritual Freedom Press. I've got a lot of essays on there that talk about this, try to shed light on it. And all I'm trying to do is get back to where the rewards for what we do in life come from taking care of each other directly, rather than realizing personal ambitions because we have to pay the bills. You see, taking care of one another directly, don't pay any bills. And I'd rather be taking care of people and trust that they will take care of me instead of taking care of my bank account, and trust that someday I'll discover there's some meaning there, which right now I can't even figure out. Keeps me alive. But there's got to be more to life than just staying alive. That's what it's all about, figuring out what that is and figuring out how to enjoy life by being who we are, instead of having to pretend we're something we're not just to survive. Thank you much. for listening.